Chapter 11 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kath Gard. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 11. Visions of the Future. Before May was out, Molly Corney was married, and had left the neighbourhood for Newcastle. Although Charlie Kinraid was not the bridegroom, Sylvia's promise to be bridesmaid was claimed. But the friendship brought on by the circumstances of neighbourhood and parity of age had become very much weakened in the time that elapsed between Molly's engagement and wedding. In the first place, she herself was so absorbed in her preparations, so elated by her good fortune in getting married, and married too before her elder sister, that all her faults blossomed out full and strong. Sylvia felt her to be selfish. Mrs. Robson thought her not maidenly. A year before she would have been far more missed and regretted by Sylvia. Now it was almost a relief to the latter to be freed from the perpetual calls upon her sympathy, from the constant demands upon her congratulations, made by one who had no thought or feeling to bestow on others, at least not in these weeks of cock-a-doodle-doing, as Mrs. Robson persisted in calling it. It was seldom that Bell was taken with a humorous idea, but this once having hatched a solitary joke, she was always clucking it into notice, to go on with her own paltry simile. Every time during that summer that Philip saw his cousin, he thought her prettier than she had ever been before. Some new touch of colour, some fresh sweet charm, seemed to have been added, just as every summer day calls out new beauty in the flowers. And this was not the addition of Philip's fancy. Hester Rose, who met Sylvia on rare occasions, came back each time with a candid, sad acknowledgment in her heart that it was no wonder that Sylvia was so much admired and loved. One day Hester had seen her sitting near her mother in the market-place. There was a basket by her, and over the clean cloth that covered the yellow pounds of butter she had laid the hedge roses and honeysuckle she had gathered on the way into Monkshaven. Her straw hat was on her knee, and she was busy placing some of the flowers in the ribbon that went round it. Then she held it on her hand, and turned it round about, putting her head on one side the better to view the effect, and all this time Hester, peeping at her through the folds of the stuffs displayed in Foster's windows, saw her with admiring wistful eyes, wondering too if Philip at the other counter were aware of his cousin's being there, so near to him. Then Sylvia put on her hat, and looking up at Foster's windows caught Hester's face of interest, and smiled and blushed at the consciousness of having been watched over her little vanities, and Hester smiled back, but rather sadly. Then a customer came in, and she had to attend to her business, which, on this as on all market days, was great. In the midst she was aware of Philip rushing bareheaded out of the shop, eager and delighted at something he saw outside. There was a little looking-glass hung against the wall on Hester's side, placed in that retired corner, in order that the good women who came to purchase headgear of any kind might see the effect thereof before they concluded their bargain. In a pause of custom, Hester, half ashamed, stole into this corner, and looked at herself in the glass. What did she see? A colourless face, dark soft hair with no light gleams in it, eyes that were melancholy instead of smiling, a mouth compressed with a sense of dissatisfaction. This was what she had to compare with the bright bonny face in the sunlight outside. She gave a gulp to check the sigh that was rising, and came back even more patient than she had been before this disheartening peep, to serve all the whims and fancies of purchasers. Sylvia herself had been rather put out by Philip's way of coming to her. It made her look so silly, she thought. And what for must he make a sight of himself, coming among the market folk in that a way? And when he took to admiring her hat, she pulled out the flowers in a pet, and threw them down and trampled them under foot. "What for art thou doing that, Sylvie?" said her mother. "The flowers is well enough. though maybe thy hat might ha' been stained." "I don't like Philip to speak to me so," said Sylvia, pouting. "How?" asked her mother. But Sylvia could not repeat his words. She hung her head, and looked red and preoccupied, anything but pleased. Philip had addressed his first expression of personal admiration at an unfortunate tune. It just shows what different views different men and women take of their fellow creatures, when I say that Hester looked upon Philip as the best and most agreeable man she had ever known. He was not one to speak of himself without being questioned on the subject, so his Haytersbank relations, only come into the neighbourhood in the last year or two, knew nothing of the trials he had surmounted, or the difficult duties he had performed. His aunt, indeed, had strong faith in him, both from partial knowledge of his character and because he was of her own tribe and kin, but she had never learnt the small details of his past life. Sylvia respected him as her mother's friend, and treated him tolerably well as long as he preserved his usual self-restraint of demeanour, but hardly ever thought of him when he was absent. Now Hester, who had watched him daily for all the years since he had first come as an errand boy into Foster's shop, watching with quiet, modest, yet observant eyes, had seen how devoted he was to his master's interests, had known of his careful and punctual ministration to his absent mother's comforts, as long as she was living to benefit by his silent, frugal self-denial. His methodical appropriation of the few hours he could call his own was not without its charms to the equally methodical Hester. The way in which he reproduced any lately acquired piece of knowledge so wearisome to Sylvia, was delightfully instructive to Hester, although, as she was habitually silent, it would have required an observer more interested in discovering her feelings than Philip was to have perceived the little flush on the pale cheek, and the brightness in the half-veiled eyes whenever he was talking. She had not thought of love on either side. Love was a vanity, a worldliness not to be spoken about, or even thought about. Once or twice, before the Robsons came into the neighbourhood, an idea had crossed her mind that possibly the quiet habitual way in which she and Philip lived together might drift them into matrimony at some distant period, and she could not bear the humble advances which Coulson, Philip's fellow lodger, sometimes made. They seemed to disgust her with him. But after the Robsons settled at Haytersbank, Philip's evenings were so often spent there that any unconscious hopes Hester might, unawares, have entertained, died away. At first she had felt a pang akin to jealousy when she heard of Sylvia, the little cousin who was passing out of childhood into womanhood. Once, early in those days, she had ventured to ask Philip what Sylvia was like. Philip had not warmed up at the question, and had given rather a dry catalogue of her features, hair, and height, but Hester, almost to her own surprise, persevered, and jerked out the final question. "Is she pretty?" Philip's sallow cheek grew deeper by 2 or 3 shades, but he answered with a tone of indifference, "I believe some folks think her so." "But do you?" persevered Hester, in spite of her being aware that he somehow disliked the question. "There's no need for talking o' such things," he answered, with abrupt displeasure. Hester silenced her curiosity from that time, but her heart was not quite at ease, and she kept on wondering whether Philip thought his little cousin pretty, until she saw her and him together, on that occasion of which we have spoken, when Sylvia came to the shop to buy her new cloak, and after that Hester never wondered whether Philip thought his cousin pretty or no, for she knew quite well. Bell Robson had her own anxieties on the subject of her daughter's increasing attractions. She apprehended the dangers consequent upon certain facts by a mental process more akin to intuition than reason. She was uncomfortable, even while her motherly vanity was flattered at the admiration Sylvia received from the other sex. This admiration was made evident to her mother in many ways. When Sylvia was with her at market, it might have been thought that the doctors had prescribed a diet of butter and eggs to all the men under 40 in Monkshaven. At first it seemed to Mrs. Robson but a natural tribute to the superior merit of her farm produce; but by degrees she perceived that if Sylvia remained at home she stood no better chance than her neighbours of an early sale. There were more customers than formerly for the fleeces stored in the wool loft. Comely young butchers came after the calf almost before it had been decided to sell it. In short, excuses were seldom wanting to those who wished to see the beauty of Haytersbank Farm. All this made Bell uncomfortable, though she could hardly have told what she dreaded. Sylvia herself seemed unspoilt by it, as far as her home relations were concerned. A little thoughtless she had always been, and thoughtless she was still; but as her mother had often said, 'You canna put old heads on young shoulders'; and if blamed for her carelessness by her parents, Sylvia was always as penitent as she could be for the time being. To be sure, it was only to her father and mother that she remained the same as she had been when an awkward lassie of 13. Out of the house there were the most contradictory opinions of her, especially if the voices of women were to be listened to. She was an ill-favoured, overgrown thing, just as bonny as the first rose in June, and as sweet in nature as honeysuckle a climbing round it. She was a vixen with a tongue sharp enough to make your very heart bleed. She was just a bit of sunshine wherever she went. She was sulky, lively, witty, silent, affectionate, or cold-hearted, according to the person who spoke about her. In fact, her peculiarity seemed to be this, that every one who knew her talked about her either in praise or blame. In church or in market she unconsciously attracted attention. They could not forget her presence, as they could that of other girls perhaps more personally attractive. Now all this was a cause of anxiety to her mother, who began to feel as if she would rather have had her child pass by in silence than so much noticed. Bell's opinion was that it was creditable to a woman to go through life in the shadow of obscurity, never named except in connection with good housewifery, husband, or children. Too much talking about a girl, even in the way of praise, disturbed Mrs. Robson's opinion of her; and when her neighbours told her how her own daughter was admired, she would reply coldly, 'She's just well enough,' and change the subject of conversation. But it was quite different with her husband. To his looser, less restrained mind, it was agreeable to hear of, and still more to see, the attention which his daughter's beauty received. He felt it as reflecting consequence on himself. He had never troubled his mind with speculations as to whether he himself was popular, still less whether he was respected. He was pretty welcome wherever he went as a jovial, good-natured man, who had done adventurous and illegal things in his youth, which in some measure entitled him to speak out his opinions on life in general, in the authoritative manner he generally used. But of the two, he preferred consorting with younger men to taking a sober stand of respectability with the elders of the place; and he perceived, without reasoning upon it, that the gay daring spirits were more desirous of his company when Sylvia was by his side than at any other time. One or two of these would saunter up to Haytersbank on a Sunday afternoon, and lounge round his fields with the old farmer. Bell kept herself from the nap which had been her weekly solace for years, in order to look after Sylvia, and on such occasions she always turned as cold a shoulder to the visitors as her sense of hospitality and of duty to her husband would permit. But if they did not enter the house, old Robson would always have Sylvia with him when he went the round of his land. Bell could see them from the upper window, the young men standing in the attitudes of listeners, while Daniel laid down the law on some point, enforcing his words by pantomimic actions with his thick stick; and Sylvia, half turning away, as if from some too admiring gaze, was possibly picking flowers out of the hedge-bank. These Sunday afternoon strolls were the plague of Bell's life that whole summer. Then it took as much of artifice as was in the simple woman's nature to keep Daniel from insisting on having Sylvia's company every time he went down to Monkshaven; and here again came a perplexity, the acknowledgment of which in distinct thought would have been an act of disloyalty according to Bell's conscience. If Sylvia went with her father, he never drank to excess, and that was a good gain to health at any rate. Drinking was hardly a sin against morals in those days and in that place, so occasionally she was allowed to accompany him to Monkshaven as a check upon his folly, for he was too fond and proud of his daughter to disgrace her by any open excess. But one Sunday afternoon, early in November, Philip came up before the time at which he usually paid his visits. He looked grave and pale, and his aunt began, "Why, lad, what's been ado? Thou'rt looking as peaked and pined as a Methody preacher after a love feast, when he's talked hisself to death's door. Thee dostna get good milk enow, that's what it is, such stuff as Monkshaven folks put up wi'. No, aunt, I'm quite well, only I'm a bit put out, vexed like at what I've heard about Sylvie." His aunt's face changed immediately. "And what'n folks say of her next thing?" "Oh," said Philip, struck by the difference of look and manner in his aunt, and subdued by seeing how instantly she took alarm, "it were only my uncle. He shouldna take a girl like her to a public. She were wi' him at t' Admiral's Head upo' All Souls' Day, that were all. There were many a one there beside. It were a statute fair, but such a one as our Sylvie ought not to be cheapened wi' t' rest." "And he took her there, did he?" said Bell, in severe meditation. "I had niver no opinion o' th' wenches as'll set theirselves to be hired for servants in th' fair. They're a bad lot as cannot find places for theirselves, 'bout going and standing to be stared at by folk, and grinning wi' the plough lads when no one's looking. It's a bad look out for t' missus as takes one o' these wenches for a servant. And dost ta mean to say as my Sylvie went and demeaned hersel to dance and marlock wi' t' fair folk at th' Admiral's Head? No, no, she didna dance, she barely set foot in th' room, but it were her own pride as saved her. Uncle would niver ha' kept her from it, for he had fallen in wi' Ailey of Seaburn and one or two others, and they were having a glass i' t' bar, and Mrs. Lawson, t' landlady, knew how there was them who would come and dance among parish prentices if need were, just to get a word or a look wi' Sylvie. So she tempts her in, saying that the room were all smartened and fine wi' flags, and there was them in the room as told me that they never was so startled as when they saw our Sylvie's face peeping in among all t' flustered maids and men, rough and red wi' weather and drink. And Jim McBean, he said she were just like a bit o' apple blossom among peonies. And some man, he didn't know who, went up and spoke to her, and either at that or at summat word she heard, for they'd got a good way on afore that time, she went quite white and mad, as if fire were coming out of her eyes. Then she turned red and left the room, for all t' landlady tried to laugh it off and keep her in. I'll be down to Monkshaven before I'm a day older, and tell Margaret Lawson some on my mind, and she'll not forget in a hurry." Bell moved as though she would put on her cloak and hood there and then. "Nay, it's not in reason as a woman in that line of life shouldn't try to make her house agreeable," said Philip. "Not wi' my wench," said Bell, in a determined voice. Philip's information had made a deeper impression on his aunt than he intended. He himself had been annoyed more at the idea that Sylvia would be spoken of as having been at a rough piece of rustic gaiety, a yearly festival for the lower classes of Yorkshire servants, outdoor as well as indoor, than at the affair itself, for he had learnt from his informant how instantaneous her appearance had been. He stood watching his aunt's troubled face, and almost wishing that he had not spoken. At last she heaved a deep sigh, and stirring the fire, as if by this little household occupation to compose her mind, she said, "It's a pity as wenches aren't lads or married folk. I could ha' wished, but it were the Lord's will. It would ha' been summat to look to if she'd had a brother. My master is so full on his own thoughts, yo see, he's no mind left for thinking on her, what wi' th' oats, and th' wool, and th' young colt, and his venture in th' Lucky Mary." She really believed her husband to have the serious and important occupation for his mind that she had been taught to consider befitting the superior intellect of the masculine gender. She would have taxed herself severely if, even in thought, she had blamed him. and Philip respected her feelings too much to say that Sylvia's father ought to look after her more closely, if he made such a pretty creature so constantly his companion, yet some such speech was only just pent within Philip's closed lips. Again his aunt spoke. 'I used to think as she and yo' might fancy one another, but thou'rt too old fashioned like for her. You wouldna suit, and it's as well, for now I can say to thee that I would take it very kindly if thou wouldst look after her a bit.' Philip's countenance fell into gloom. He had to gulp down certain feelings before he could make answer with discretion. 'How can I look after her, and me tied to the shop more and more every day?' 'I could send her on a bit of an errand to Foster's, and then for sure yo' might keep an eye upon her when she's in town, and just walk a bit way with her when she's in t' street, and keep t'other fellows off her. Ned Simpson, t' butcher, in special, for folks do say he means no good by any girl he goes wi'. And I'll ask father to leave her a bit more wi' me. They're coming down t' brow, and Ned Simpson with 'em. Now, Philip, I look to thee to do a brother's part by my wench, and warn off all as isn't fit.' The door opened, and the coarse, strong voice of Simpson made itself heard. He was a stout man, comely enough as to form and feature, but with a depth of colour in his face that betokened the coming on of the habits of the sot. His Sunday hat was in his hand, and he smoothed the long nap of it, as he said, with a mixture of shyness and familiarity, 'Sarvant, missus, your measter is fain that I should come in and have a drop. No offence, I hope.' Sylvia passed quickly through the house place, and went upstairs without speaking to her cousin Philip or to any one. He sat on, disliking the visitor, and almost disliking his hospitable uncle for having brought Simpson into the house, sympathising with his aunt in the spirit which prompted her curt answers, and in the intervals of all these feelings wondering what ground she had for speaking as if she had now given up all thought of Sylvia and him ever being married, and in what way he was too old fashioned. Robson would gladly have persuaded Philip to join him and Simpson in their drink, but Philip was in no sociable mood, and sate a little aloof, watching the staircase down which sooner or later Sylvia must come, for, as perhaps has been already said, the stairs went up straight out of the kitchen, and at length his yearning watch was rewarded. First, the little pointed toe came daintily in sight, then the trim ankle in the tight blue stocking, the wool of which was spun and the web of which was knitted by her mother's careful hands. Then the full brown stuff petticoat, the arm holding the petticoat back in decent folds so as not to encumber the descending feet, the slender neck and shoulders hidden under the folded square of fresh white muslin, the crowning beauty of the soft innocent face, radiant in colour, and with the light brown curls clustering around. She made her way quickly to Philip's side. How his heart beat at her approach, and even more when she entered into a low-voiced tete-a-tete. 'Isn't he gone yet?' said she. 'I cannot abide him. I could ha' pinched father when he asked him for to come in.' 'Maybe he'll not stay long,' said Philip, hardly understanding the meaning of what he said, so sweet was it to have her making her whispered confidences to him. But Simpson was not going to let her alone in the dark corner between the door and the window. He began paying her some coarse country compliments, too strong in their direct flattery for even her father's taste, more especially as he saw by his wife's set lips and frowning brow how much she disapproved of their visitor's style of conversation. 'Come, measter, leave t' lass alone. She's set up enough a'ready, and mother makes such a deal on her. You and me's men for sensible talk at our time o' life; and as I was saying, t' horse was a weaver if iver one was, as any one could ha' told as had come within a mile on him.' And in this way the old farmer and the bluff butcher chatted on about horses, while Philip and Sylvia sate together, he turning over all manner of hopes and projects for the future, in spite of his aunt's opinion that he was too old-fashioned for her dainty blooming daughter. Perhaps, too, Mrs. Robson saw some reason for changing her mind on this head as she watched Sylvia this night, for she accompanied Philip to the door, when the time came for him to start homewards, and bade him good night with unusual fervour, adding, "Thou'st been a deal o' comfort to me, lad, almost as one as if thou wert a child o' my own, as at times I could welly think thou art to be. Anyways, I trust to thee to look after the lile lass, as has no brother to guide her among men. And men's very kittle for a woman to deal wi', but if thou'lt have an eye on whom she consorts wi', my mind'll be easier." Philip's heart beat fast, but his voice was as calm as usual when he replied, "I'd just keep her a bit aloof from Monkshaven folks. A lass is always the more thought on for being chary of herself; and as for t' rest, I'll have an eye to the folks she goes among; and if I see that they don't befit her, I'll just give her a warning, for she's not one to like such chaps as yon Simpson there. She can see what's becoming in a man to say to a lass, and what's not." Philip set out on his 2-mile walk home with a tumult of happiness in his heart. He was not often carried away by delusions of his own creating. To-night he thought he had good ground for believing that by patient self-restraint he might win Sylvia's love. A year ago he had nearly earned her dislike by obtruding upon her looks and words betokening his passionate love. He alarmed her girlish coyness, as well as wearied her with the wish he had then felt that she should take an interest in his pursuits. But, with unusual wisdom, he had perceived his mistake. It was many months now since he had betrayed by word or look that she was anything more to him than a little cousin to be cared for and protected when need was. The consequence was that she had become tamed, just as a wild animal is tamed. He had remained tranquil and impassive, almost as if he did not perceive her shy advances towards friendliness. These advances were made by her after the lessons had ceased. She was afraid lest he was displeased with her behaviour in rejecting his instructions, and was not easy till she was at peace with him; and now, to all appearance, he and she were perfect friends, but nothing more. In his absence she would not allow her young companions to laugh at his grave sobriety of character and somewhat prim demeanour. She would even go against her conscience and deny that she perceived any peculiarity. When she wanted it, she sought his advice on such small subjects as came up in her daily life, and she tried not to show signs of weariness when he used more words, and more difficult words, than were necessary to convey his ideas. But her ideal husband was different from Philip in every point. The two images never for an instant merged into one. To Philip she was the only woman in the world. It was the one subject on which he dared not consider, for fear that both conscience and judgment should decide against him, and that he should be convinced against his will that she was an unfit mate for him, that she never would be his, and that it was a waste of time and life to keep her shrined in the dearest sanctuary of his being, to the exclusion of all the serious and religious aims which, in any other case, he would have been the first to acknowledge as the object he ought to pursue. For he had been brought up among the Quakers, and shared in their austere distrust of a self-seeking spirit. Yet what else but self-seeking was his passionate prayer, "Give me Sylvia, or else I die"? No other vision had ever crossed his masculine fancy for a moment. His was a rare and constant love that deserved a better fate than it met with. At this time his hopes were high, as I have said, not merely as to the growth of Sylvia's feelings towards him, but as to the probability of his soon being in a position to place her in such comfort as his wife, as she had never enjoyed before. For the brothers Foster were thinking of retiring from business, and relinquishing the shop to their two shopmen, Philip Hepburn and William Coulson. To be sure, it was only by looking back for a few months, and noticing chance expressions and small indications, that this intention of theirs could be discovered. But every step they took tended this way, and Philip knew their usual practice of deliberation too well to feel in the least impatient for the quicker progress of the end which he saw steadily approaching. The whole atmosphere of life among the friends at this date partook of this character of self-repression, and both Coulson and Hepburn shared in it. Coulson was just as much aware of the prospect opening before him as Hepburn, but they never spoke together on the subject, although their mutual knowledge might be occasionally implied in their conversation on their future lives. Meanwhile the Fosters were imparting more of the background of their business to their successors. For the present at least, the brothers meant to retain an interest in the shop, even after they had given up the active management, and they sometimes thought of setting up a separate establishment as bankers. The separation of the business, the introduction of their shopmen to the distant manufacturers who furnished their goods. In those days the system of travellers was not so widely organised as it is at present. All these steps were in gradual progress, and already Philip saw himself in imagination in the dignified position of joint master of the principal shop in Monkshaven, with Sylvia installed as his wife, with certainly a silk gown, and possibly a gig at her disposal. In all Philip's visions of future prosperity, it was Sylvia who was to be aggrandized by them. His own life was to be spent as it was now, pretty much between the 4 shop walls. End of chapter 11.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Martin Sandino. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 12. All this enlargement of interest in the shop occupied Philip fully for some months after the period referred to in the preceding chapter. Remembering his last conversation with his aunt, he might have been uneasy at his inability to perform his promise and look after his pretty cousin, but that about the middle of November Belle Robson had fallen ill of a rheumatic fever, and that her daughter had been entirely absorbed in nursing her. No thought of company or gaiety was in Sylvia's mind as long as her mother's illness lasted. Vehement in all her feelings, she discovered in the dread of losing her mother how passionately she was attached to her. Hitherto she had supposed, as children so often do, that her parents would live for ever, and now when it was a question of days, whether by that time the following week her mother might not be buried out of her sight for ever, she clung to every semblance of service to be rendered, or affection shown, as if she hoped to condense the love and care of years into the few days only that might remain. Mrs. Robson lingered on, began slowly to recover, and before Christmas was again sitting by the fireside in the house place, wan and pulled down, muffled up with shawls and blankets, but still there once more, where not long before Sylvia had scarcely expected to see her again. Philip came up that evening and found Sylvia in wild spirits. She thought that everything was done, now that her mother had once again come downstairs. She laughed with glee, she kissed her mother, she shook hands with Philip, she almost submitted to a speech of more than usual tenderness for him. But, in the midst of his words, her mother's pillows wanted arranging, and she went to her chair, paying no more heed to his words than if they had been addressed to the cat, that lying on the invalid's knee was purring out her welcome to the weak hand feebly stroking her back. Robson himself soon came in, looking older and more subdued since Philip had seen him last. He was very urgent that his wife should have some spirits and water, but on her refusal, almost as if she loathed the thought of the smell, he contented himself with sharing her tea, though he kept abusing the beverage as washing the heart out of a man, and attributing all the degeneracy of the world, growing up about him in his old age, to the drinking of such slop. At the same time, his little self-sacrifice put him in an unusually good temper, and mingled with his real gladness at having his wife once more on their way to recovery, brought back some of the old charm of tenderness combined with light-heartedness, which had won the sober Isabella Preston long ago. He sat by her side, holding her hand, and talking of old times to the young couple opposite, of his adventures and escapes, and how he had won his wife. She, faintly smiling at the remembrance of those days, yet half ashamed at having the little details of her courtship revealed, from time to time kept saying, "For shame with 'ee, Dannel, I never did," and faint denials of a similar kind. "Never believe her, Sylvie. She were a woman, and there's niver a woman but likes to have a sweetheart, and can tell when a chap's casting sheep's eyes at her, ay, and afore he knows what he's about hissen. She were a pretty one then, was my old woman, and like them as thought her so, though she did cock her head high, as being a Preston, which were a family o' standing and means i' those parts aforetime. There's Philip there, I'll warrant, is as proud o' being Preston by t' mother's side, for it runs i' t' blood, lass. I can tell when a child of a Preston takes to being proud o' their kin, by t' cut o' their nose. Now Philip's and my missus's had a turn beyond common i' their nostrils, as if they was sniffling at t' rest o' the world, and seeing if we was good enough for 'em to consort wi'. Thee and me, lass, is Robsons, oat cake folk, while they's pie crust. Lord, how Bell used to speak to me, as short as though a wasn't a Christian; and at t' time she loved me as her very life, and well a knew it, though a'd to mark as though a didn't. Philip, when thou go'st courtin', come to me, and I'll give thee many a wrinkle. I've shown, too, as a known well how to choose a good wife, by tokens and signs. Hanna ta, missus? Come to me, my lad, and show me t' lass, and I'll just tak' a squint at her, and tell you if she'll do or not; and if she'll do, I'll teach you how to win her.' 'They say another o' yon Corney girls is going to be married,' said Mrs. Robson, in her faint deliberate tones. 'By gosh, and it's well thou spokest on them. I was as clean forgetting it as iver could be. I met Nanny Corney i' Monkshaven last neet, and she axed me for to let our Sylvia come o' New Year's Eve, and see Molly and her man. That, and as is wed beyond Newcastle, they'll be over at her feyther's for to New Year's Eve, and there's to be a merry making.' Sylvia's colour came, her eyes brightened. She would have liked to go, but the thought of her mother came across her, and her features fell. Her mother's eye caught the look and the change, and knew what both meant as well as if Sylvia had spoken out. 'Thursday's to night,' said she. 'I'll be rare and strong by then, and Sylvie shall go play hersen. She's been nurse tending long enough.' 'You're but weakly yet,' said Philip shortly. He did not intend to say it, but the words seemed to come out in spite of himself. 'I said as our lass should come, God willing, if she only came and went, and thee going on sprightly, old woman, and I'll turn nurse tender mysen for t' occasion, special if thou can stand t' good honest smell o' whisky by then. So, my lass, get up thy smart clothes, and cut t' best on 'em out, as becomes a Preston. Maybe I'll fetch thee home, and maybe Philip will convoy thee, for Nanny Corney bade thee to merry making as well. She said her measter would be seemed thee about t' wool afore then.' 'I don't think I can go,' said Philip, secretly pleased to know that he had the opportunity in his power. 'I'm half bound to go wi' Hester Rose and her mother to watch night.' 'Is Hester a Methody?' asked Sylvia in surprise. 'No, she's neither a Methody, nor a Friend, nor a Church person; but she's a turn for serious things, choose wherever they're found.' 'Well, then,' said good natured Farmer Robson, only seeing the surface of things, 'I'll make shift to fetch Sylvia back fra' t' merry making, and thee and thy young woman can go to prayer making. It's every man to his taste, say I.' But in spite of his half promise, nay, against his natural inclination, Philip was lured to the Corneys' by the thought of meeting Sylvia, of watching her, and exulting in her superiority in pretty looks and ways to all the other girls likely to be assembled. Besides, he told his conscience, he was pledged to his aunt to watch over Sylvia like a brother. So in the interval before New Year's Eve he silently revelled as much as any young girl in the anticipation of the happy coming time. At this hour, all the actors in the story having played out their parts and gone to their rest, there is something touching in recording the futile efforts made by Philip to win Sylvia the love he yearned for. But at the time any one who had watched him might have been amused to see the grave, awkward, plain young man studying patterns and colours for a new waistcoat, with his head a little on one side, after the meditative manner common to those who are choosing a new article of dress. They might have smiled could they have read in his imagination the frequent rehearsal of the coming evening, when he and she should each be dressed in their gala attire, to spend a few hours under a bright festive aspect among people whose company would oblige them to assume a new demeanour towards each other, not so familiar as their everyday manner, but allowing more scope for the expression of rustic gallantry. Philip had so seldom been to anything of the kind, that even had Sylvia not been going, he would have felt a kind of shy excitement at the prospect of anything so unusual. But, indeed, if Sylvia had not been going, it is very probable that Philip's rigid conscience might have been aroused to the question whether such parties did not savour too much of the world for him to form one in them. As it was, however, the facts to him were simply these. He was going, and she was going. The day before he had hurried off to Hayterbank Farm with a small paper parcel in his pocket, a ribbon with a little briar rose pattern running upon it for Sylvia. It was the first thing he had ever ventured to give her. The first thing of the kind would, perhaps, be more accurate, for when he had begun to teach her any lessons he had given her Mavor's spelling book, but that he might have done out of zeal for knowledge to any dunce of a little girl of his acquaintance. The ribbon was quite a different kind of present. He touched it tenderly, as if he were caressing it. When he thought of her wearing it, the briar rose, sweetness and thorns, seemed to be the very flower for her. The soft green ground on which the pink and brown pattern ran was just the colour to show off her complexion, and she would in a way belong to him, her cousin, her mentor, her chaperone, her lover. While others only admired, he might hope to appropriate, for of late they had been such happy friends. Her mother approved of him, her father liked him. A few months, perhaps only a few weeks more of self-restraint, then he might go and speak openly of his wishes, and what he had to offer. For he had resolved, with the quiet force of his character, to wait until all was settled between him and his masters, before he declared himself to either Sylvia or her parents. The interval was spent in patient, silent endeavours to recommend himself to her. He had to give his ribbon to his aunt in charge for Sylvia, and that was a disappointment to his fancy, although he tried to reason himself into thinking that it was better so. He had not time to wait for her to return from some errand on which she had gone, for he was daily more and more occupied with the affairs of the shop. Sylvia made many a promise to her mother, and more to herself, that she would not stay late at the party, but she might go as early as she liked, and before the December daylight had faded away, Sylvia presented herself at the Corneys'. She was to come early in order to help set out the supper, which was arranged in the large old flagged parlour, which served as a best bedroom as well. It opened out of the house place, and was the sacred room of the house, and chambers of a similar description are still considered in retired farmhouses in the north of England. They are used on occasions like the one now described for purposes of hospitality, but in the state bed, overshadowing so large a portion of the floor, the births and, as far as may be, the deaths of the household take place. At the Corneys' the united efforts of some former generation of the family had produced patchwork curtains and coverlet, and patchwork was patchwork in those days, before the early Yeats and Peels had found out the secret of printing the parsley leaf. Scraps of costly Indian chintzes and palampours were intermixed with commoner black and red calico in minute hexagons, and the variety of patterns served for the useful purpose of promoting conversations as well as the more obvious one of displaying the workwoman's taste. Sylvia, for instance, began at once to her old friend Molly Brunton, who had accompanied her into this chamber to take off her hat and cloak, with a remark of one of the chintzes. Stooping over the counterpane, with a face into which the flush would come whether or no, she said to Molly, "Dear, I never seed this one afore. This, for all t' world like the eyes in a peacock's tail." "Thou's seen it many times and oft, lass. But weren't thou surprised to find Charlie here? We picked him up at Shields, quite by surprise like, and when Brunton and me said we was coming here, nought would serve him but coming with us, for to see t' New Year in. It's a pity as your mother's ta'en this time for to fall ill, and want you back so early." Sylvia had taken off her hat and cloak by this time, and began to help Molly and a younger unmarried sister in laying out the substantial supper. "Here," continued Mrs. Brunton, "stick a bit o' holly in yon pig's mouth. That's the way we do things in Newcastle. But folks is so behindhand in Monkshaven. It's a fine thing to live in a large town, Sylvia, and if you're looking out for a husband, I'd advise you to take one as lives in a town. I feel as if I were buried alive coming back here. Such an out o' t' way place after t' side, where there's many 100 carts and carriages go past in a day. I've a great mind for to take you two lassies back with me, and let you see a bit o' the world. Maybe I may yet." Her sister Bessy looked much pleased with this plan, but Sylvia was rather inclined to take offence at Molly's patronising ways, and replied, "I'm none so fond o' noise and bustle. Why, you'll not be able to hear yourself speak wi' all them carts and carriages. I'd rather bide at home, let alone that mother can't spare me." It was perhaps a rather ungracious way of answering Molly Brunton's speech, and so she felt it, although her invitation had been none of the most courteously worded. She irritated Sylvia still further by repeating her last words. "Mother can't spare me! Why, mother'll have to spare thee some time, when the time for wedding comes." "I'm none going to be wed," said Sylvia, "and if I were, I'd niver go far from mother. Eh, what a spoilt darling it is! How Brunton will laugh when I tell him about you! Brunton's a rare one for laughing. It's a great thing to have got such a merry man for a husband. Why, he has his joke for every one as comes into t' shop, and he'll have something funny to say to everything this evening." Bessy saw that Sylvia was annoyed, and with more delicacy than her sister, she tried to turn the conversation. "That's a pretty ribbon in thy hair, Sylvia. I'd like to have one o' t' same pattern. Feyther likes pickled walnuts stuck about to round a beef, Molly." "I know what I'm about," replied Mrs. Brunton, with a toss of her merry head. Bessy resumed her inquiry. "Is there any more to be had where this come from, Sylvia?" "I don't know," replied Sylvia. "It's come fra Foster's, and you can ask." "What might it cost?" said Betsy, fingering end of it to test its quality. "I can't tell," said Sylvia. "It were a present." "Niver mak ado about t' price," said Molly. "I'll gi' thee enough onto to tie up thy hair, just like Sylvia's. Only thou hasn't such wealth o' curls as she has. It'll niver look t' same i' thy straight locks." "And who might it be as give it thee, Sylvia?" asked the unscrupulous, if good-natured Molly. "My cousin Philip, him as is shopman at Foster's," said Sylvia innocently. But it was far too good an opportunity for the exercise of Molly's kind of wit for her to pass over. "Oho! Our cousin Philip, is it? And he'll not be living so far away from your mother? I've no need to be a witch to put two and two together. He's a coming here to night, isn't he, Bessy?" "I wish you wouldn't talk so, Molly," said Sylvia. "Me and Philip is good enough friends, but we niver think on each other that way. Leastways I don't." Sweet butter, now that's my mother's old-fashioned ways, as if folks must eat sweet butter nowadays because her mother did. That way," continued Molly, in the manner that annoyed Sylvia so much, repeating her words as if for the purpose of laughing at them, "that way? And pray what is it you're speaking on? I never said nought about marrying, did I, that yo' needs to look so red and shamefaced about your cousin Philip? But as Brunton says, if t' cap fits on you, put it on. I'm glad he's coming over to night, though, for as I'm done making love and courting, it's next best to watch other folks. And your face, Sylvia, has letten me into a secret, as I'd some glimpses on afore I was wed." Sylvia discreetly determined not to speak a word more to Philip than she could help, and wondered how she could ever have liked Molly at all, much less have made a companion of her. The table was now laid out, and nothing remained but to criticise the arrangement a little. Bessy was full of admiration. "There, Molly," said she, "you niver seen more victual brought together in Newcastle, I'll be bound. There'll be 1/2 weight of butcher's meat, besides pies and custards. I've eaten no dinner these 2 days for thinking on it. It's been a weary burden on my mind, but it's off now I see how well it looks. I told mother not to come near it till we'd spread it all out, and now I'll go fetch her." Bessy ran off into the house place. "It's well enough in a country kind o' way," said Molly, with a faint approbation of condescension, "but if I'd thought on, I'd ha' brought him down a beast or two done a sponge cake, with currants for his eyes to give to table and air." The door was opened, and Bessy came in smiling and blushing with proud pleasure. Her mother followed her on tiptoe, smoothing down her apron, and with her voice subdued to a whisper. "Ah, my lass, it is fine, but dinna mak' an ado about it. Let them think it's just our common way. If any one says aught about how good t' victual is, tak' it calm, and say we'n better in t' house. It'll make 'em eat wi' a better appetite, and think the more on us. Sylvie, I'm much beholden to ye for coming so early, and helping t' lass, but you mun come in t' house place now. The folks is gathering, and your cousin's been asking after you already." Molly gave her a nudge which made Sylvia go all aflame with angry embarrassment. She was conscious that the watching which Molly had threatened her with began directly, for Molly went up to her husband and whispered something to him which set him off in a chuckling laugh, and Sylvia was aware that his eyes followed her about with knowing looks all the evening. She would hardly speak to Philip, and pretended not to see his outstretched hand, but passed on to the chimney corner, and tried to shelter herself behind the broad back of Farmer Corney, who had no notion of relinquishing his customary place for all the young people who ever came to the house, or for any old people either, for that matter. It was his household throne, and there he sat with no more idea of abdicating in his favour of any comer than King George at St. James's. But he was glad to see his friends, and had paid them the unwonted compliment of shaving on a week day, and putting on his Sunday coat. The united efforts of his wife and children had failed to persuade him to make any farther change in his attire. To all their arguments on this head he had replied, "Them as doesn't like to see me in my workaday waistcoat and breeches may bide away." It was the longest sentence he had said that day, but he repeated it several times over. He was glad enough to see all the young people, but they were not of his kidney, as he expressed it to himself, and he did not feel any call upon himself to entertain them. He left that to his bustling wife, all smartness and smiles, and to his daughters and son-in-law. His efforts at hospitality consisted in sitting still, smoking his pipe. When any one came, he took it out of his mouth for an instant, and nodded his head in a cheerful, friendly way, without a word of speech, and then returned to his smoking with the greater relish for the moment's intermission. He thought to himself, "They're a set o' young chaps as thinks more on t' lasses than on baccy. They'll find out their mistake in time. Give 'em time, give 'em time." And before 8 o'clock he went as quietly as a man of 12 stone can upstairs to bed, having made a previous arrangement with his wife that she should bring him up about 2 pounds of spiced beef, and a hot tumbler of stiff grog. But at the beginning of the evening he formed a good screen for Sylvia, who was rather a favourite with the old man, for twice he spoke to her. "Feyther smokes?" "Yes," said Sylvia. "Reach me tobaccy box, me lass." And that was all the conversation that passed between her and her nearest neighbour for the first quarter of an hour after she came into company. But, for all her screen, she felt a pair of eyes were fixed upon her with a glow of admiration deepening their honest brightness. Somehow, look in what direction she would, she caught the glance of those eyes before she could see anything else, so she played with her apron strings and tried not to feel so conscious. There were another pair of eyes. Not such beautiful sparkling eyes, deep-set, earnest, sad, nay, even gloomy, watching her every movement, but of this she was not aware. Philip had not recovered from the rebuff she had given him by refusing his offered hand, and was standing still, in angry silence, when Mrs. Corney thrust a young woman just arrived upon his attention. "Come, Mr. Hepburn, here's Nancy Pratt without even a soul to speak to her, and you moping there. She says she knows you for sight, for having dealt at Foster's these 6 year. See if you can find somewhat to say to each other, for I'm go pour out tea. Dixons and Walkers and Elliots and Smiths is come," said she, making off the families with her fingers as she looked round and called over their names. "And there's only Will Lantham and his 2 sisters, and Roger Harbottle and Taylor to come, and they'll turn up afore tea's ended." So she went off to her duty at the one table, which, placed alongside of the dresser, was the only article of furniture left in the middle of the room, all the seats being arranged as close to the 4 walls as could be managed. The candles of those days gave but a faint light compared to the light of the immense fire, which it was a point of hospitality to keep at the highest roaring blazing pitch. These young women occupied their seats with the exception of 2 or 3 of the elder ones, who, in an eager desire to show their capability, insisted on helping Mrs. Corney in her duties, very much to her annoyance, as there were certain little contrivances for eking out cream, and adjusting the strength of the cups of tea to the worldly position of the intended drinkers, which she did not like every one to see. The young men, whom tea did not embolden, and who had as yet had no chance of stronger liquor, clustered in rustic shyness round the door, not speaking even to themselves, except now and then, when one, apparently the wag of the party, made some whispered remark, which set them all off laughing. But in a minute they checked themselves, and passed the back of their hands across their mouths to compose that unlucky feature, and then some would try to fix their eyes on the rafters of the ceiling, in a manner which was decorous if rather abstracted from the business in hand. Most of these were young farmers with whom Philip had nothing in common, and from whom, in shy reserve, he had withdrawn himself when he first came in. But now he wished himself among them sooner than to talk to Nancy Pratt, when he had nothing to say. And yet he might have had a companion less to his mind, for she was a decent young woman of a sober age, less inclined to giggle than many of the younger ones. But all the time that he was making commonplace remarks to her he was wondering if he had offended Sylvia, and why she would not shake hands with him. And this preoccupation of his thoughts did not make him an agreeable companion. Nancy Pratt, who had been engaged for some years to a mate of a whaling ship, perceived something of his state of mind, and took no offence at it. On the contrary, she tried to give him pleasure by admiring Sylvia. "I've often heard tell on her," said she, "but I never thought she'd be so pretty, and so staid and quiet like too. To most part of girls as looks like her are always gape-gazing to catch other folks' eyes, and see what is thought on them. But she looks just like a child, a bit flustered wi' coming into company, getting into as dark a corner, and biding as still as she can." Just then Sylvia lifted up her long dark lashes, and catching the same glance which she had so often met before, Charlie Kinraid was standing talking to Brunton on the opposite side of the fireplace. She startled back into the shadow as if she had not expected it, and in so doing spilt her tea all over her gown. She could almost have cried, she felt herself so awkward, and as if everything was going wrong with her. She thought that every one would think she had never been in company before, and did not know how to behave, and while she was thus fluttered and crimson, she saw through her tearful eyes Kinraid on his knees before her, wiping her gown with his silk pocket handkerchief, and heard him speaking through all the buzz of commiserating voices. "Your cupboard handle is so much i' the way. I hurt my elbow against it only this very afternoon." So perhaps it was no clumsiness of hers, as they would all know now, since he had so skilfully laid the blame somewhere else. And after all it turned out that her accident had been the means of bringing him across to her side, which was much more pleasant than having him opposite staring at her, for now he began to talk to her, and this was very pleasant, although she was rather embarrassed at their tete-a-tete at first. "Did not know you again when I first saw you," said he, in a tone which implied a good deal more than was uttered in his words. "I knowed you at once," she replied, softly, and then she blushed and played with her apron string, and wondered if she ought to have confessed to the clearness of her recollection. "You've grown up into well, perhaps it's not manners to say what you're grown into. Anyhow, I shan't forget you again." More playing with her apron string, and head hung still lower down, though the corners of her mouth would go up in a shy smile of pleasure. Philip watched it all as greedily as if it gave him delight. "Your father, he'll be well and hearty, I hope?" asked Charlie. "Yes," replied Sylvia, and then she wished she could originate some remark. He would think her so stupid if she just kept on saying such little short bits of speeches, and if he thought her stupid he might perhaps go away again to his former place. But he was quite far gone in love of her beauty and pretty modest ways, not to care much whether she talked or no, so long as she showed herself so pleasingly conscious of his close neighbourhood. "I must come and see the old gentleman, and your mother too," he added more slowly, for he remembered that his visits last year had not been quite so much welcomed by Belle Robson as by her husband. Perhaps it was because of the amount of drink which he and Daniel had managed to get through of an evening. He resolved this year to be more careful to please the mother of Sylvia. End of chapter 12. Recording by Amanda Martin Sandino. Bothell, Washington.
Part 2 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwes. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 13. When tea was ended there was a great bustle and shifting of places, while Mrs. Corney and her daughters carried out trays full of used cups and great platters of uneaten bread and butter into the back kitchen, to be washed up after the guests were gone. Just because she was so conscious that she did not want to move and break up the little conversation between herself and Kinraid, Sylvia forced herself to be as active in the service going on as became a friend of the house, and she was too much her mother's own daughter to feel comfortable at leaving all the things in the disorder which to the Corney girls was second nature. "This milk mun go back to Daddy, I reckon," said she, loading herself with milk and cream. "Never fash thyself about it," said Nellie Corney. "Christmas comes but once a year, if it does go sour, and mother said she'd have a game at forfeits, first thing after tea, to loosen folks' tongues, and mix up to lads and lasses, so come along." But Sylvia steered her careful way to the cold chill of the dairy, and would not be satisfied till she had carried away all the unused provision into some fresher air than that heated by the fires and ovens used for the long day's cooking of pies and cakes and much roast meat. When they came back, a round of red-faced lads, as young men up to 35 are called in Lancashire and Yorkshire if they are not married before, and lasses whose age was not to be defined, were playing at some country game, in which the women were apparently more interested than the men, who looked shamefaced and afraid of each other's ridicule. Mrs. Corney, however, knew how to remedy this, and at a sign from her, a great jug of beer was brought in. This jug was the pride of her heart, and was in the shape of a fat man in white knee breeches and a three-cornered hat. With one arm he supported the pipe in his broad smiling mouth, and the other was placed akimbo and formed the handle. There was also a great china punch bowl filled with grog, made out of an old ship receipt current in these parts, but not too strong, because if their visitors had too much to drink at that early part of the evening, it would spoil the fun, as Nellie Corney had observed. Her father, however, after the notions of hospitality prevalent at the time in higher circles, had stipulated that each man should have enough before he left the house. Enough meaning, in Monkshaven parlance, the liberty of getting drunk, if they thought fit to do it. Before long, one of the lads was seized with a fit of admiration for Toby, the name of the gentleman who contained liquor, and went up to the tray for a closer inspection. He was speedily followed by other amateurs of curious earthenware, and by Mr. Brunton, who had been charged by his mother-in-law with the due supplying of liquor, by his father-in-law that every man should have his fill, and by his wife and her sisters that no one should have too much, at any rate at the beginning of the evening, thought fit to carry out Toby to be replenished, and a faster spirit of enjoyment and mirth began to reign in the room. Kinraid was too well seasoned to care what amount of liquor he drank. Philip had what was called a weak head, and disliked muddling himself with drink because of the immediate consequence of intense feelings of irritability, and the more distant one of a racking headache the next day. So both these two preserved very much the same demeanour they had held at the beginning of the evening. Sylvia was by all acknowledged and treated as the belle. When they played at blind man's buff, go where she would, she was always caught. She was called out repeatedly to do what was required in any game, as if all had a pleasure in seeing her light figure and deft ways. She was sufficiently pleased with this to have got over her shyness with all except Charlie. When others paid her their rustic compliments, she tossed her head and made her little saucy repartees. But when he said something low and flattering, it was too honey-sweet to her heart to be thrown off thus. And somehow, the more she yielded to this fascination, the more she avoided Philip. He did not speak flatteringly. He did not pay compliments. He watched her with discontented, longing eyes, and grew more inclined every moment, as he remembered his anticipation of a happy evening, to cry out in his heart, "Vanitas vanitatum." And now came crying the forfeits. Molly Brunton knelt down, her face buried in her mother's lap. The latter took out the forfeits one by one, and as she held them up, said the accustomed formula. "A fine thing, and a very fine thing. What must he or she do who owns this thing?" One or two had been told to kneel to the prettiest, bow to the wittiest, and kiss those they loved best. Others had had to bite an inch off the poker, or such plays upon words. And now came Sylvia's pretty new ribbon that Philip had given her. He almost longed to snatch it out of Mrs. Corney's hands, burn it before all their faces, so annoyed was he with the whole affair. A fine thing, and a very fine thing. A most particular fine thing. Chose how she came by it. What must she do as owns this thing? She must blow out the candle and kiss the candlestick. In one instant Kinraid had hold of the only candle within reach. All the others had been put up high on inaccessible shelves and other places. Sylvia went up and blew out the candle, and before the sudden partial darkness was over, he had taken the candle into his fingers, and, according to the traditional meaning of the words, was in the place of the candlestick, and as such was to be kissed. Everyone laughed at the innocent Sylvia's face as the meaning of the penance came into it. Everyone but Philip, who almost choked. "I'm a candlestick," said Kinraid, with less triumph in his voice than he would have had with any other girl in the room. "You mun kiss the candlestick," cried the Corneys, "or you'll never get your ribbon back." "And she sets a deal of store by that ribbon," said Molly Brunton maliciously. "I'll none kiss candlestick, nor him either," said Sylvia in a low voice of determination, turning away, full of confusion. "You'll none get your ribbon if you don't," cried one and all. "I don't care for the ribbon," said she, flashing up with a look at her tormentors. Now her back was turned to Kinraid. "And I wunna play any more at such like a games," she added, with fresh indignation rising in her heart, as she took her old place in the corner of the room, a little away from the rest. Philip's spirits rose, and he yearned to go to her and tell her how he approved of her conduct. Alas, Philip! Sylvia, though as modest a girl as ever lived, was no prude, and had been brought up in simple, straightforward country ways. And with any other young man, excepting perhaps Philip's self, she would have thought no more of making a rapid pretence of kissing the hand or cheek of the temporary candlestick, than our ancestresses did in much higher rank in similar occasions. Kinraid, though mortified by his public rejection, was more conscious of this than the inexperienced Philip, for he resolved not to be balked, and watched his opportunity. For the time he went on playing as if Sylvia's conduct had not affected him in the least, and as if he was hardly aware of her defection from the game. As she saw others submitting, quite as a matter of course, to similar penances, she began to be angry with herself for having thought twice about it, and almost to dislike herself for the strange consciousness which had made it at the time seem impossible to do what she was told. Her eyes kept filling with tears, as her isolated position in the gay party, the thought of what a fool she had made herself, kept recurring to her mind. But no one saw her, she thought, thus crying, and ashamed to be discovered when the party should pause in their game, she stole round behind them into the great chamber in which she had helped to lay out the supper, with the intention of bathing her eyes and taking a drink of water. One instant Charlie Kinraid was missing from the circle, of which he was the life and soul, and then back he came, with an air of satisfaction on his face, intelligible enough to those who had seen his game, but unnoticed by Philip, who, amidst the perpetual noise and movements around him, had not perceived Sylvia's leaving the room, until she came back at the end of about a quarter of an hour, looking lovelier than ever, her complexion brilliant, her eyes drooping, her hair neatly and freshly arranged, tied with a brown ribbon instead of that she was supposed to have forfeited. She looked as if she did not wish her return to be noticed, stealing softly behind the romping lads and lasses with noiseless motions, and altogether such a contrast to them in her cool freshness and modest neatness that both Kinraid and Philip found it difficult to keep their eyes off her. But the former had a secret triumph in his heart, which enabled him to go on his merry-making as if it absorbed him, while Philip dropped out of the crowd and came up to where she was standing silently by Mrs. Corney, who, arms akimbo, was laughing at the frolic and fun around her. Sylvia started a little when Philip spoke, and kept her soft eyes averted from him after the first glance. She answered him shortly, but with unaccustomed gentleness. He had only asked her when she would like him to take her home, and she, a little surprised at the idea of going home, when to her the evening seemed only beginning, had answered, "Go home? I don't know. It's New Year's Eve." "Aye, but your mamma will lie awake till you come home, Sylvie." But Mrs. Corney, having heard his question, broke in with all sorts of upbraidings. "Go home! Not see to New Year in! Why, what should take 'em home than 6 hours? Wasn't there a moon as clear as day? And did such a time as this come often? And were they to break up the party before the New Year came in? And were there not supper with a spiced round of beef that had not been in pickle pretty nigh since Martinmas, and hams, and mince pies, and what not? and if they thought any evil of our master's going to bed, or that by early retirement he meant to imply that he did not bid his friends welcome, why, he would not stay up beyond 8 o'clock for King George upon his throne, and he'd tell them soon enough if they'd only step upstairs and ask him. Well, she knowed what it was like to have a daughter when she was ailing, so she'd say naught more, but hasten supper. And this idea now took possession of Mrs. Corney's mind, for she would not willingly allow one of her guests to leave before they had done justice to her preparations, and cutting her speech short, she hastily left Sylvia and Philip together. His heart beat fast. His feeling towards her had never been so strong or so distinct as since her refusal to kiss the candlestick. He was on the point of speaking, of saying something explicitly tender, when the wooden trencher which the party were using at their play came bowling between him and Sylvia, and sprung out of its little period right betwixt them. Everyone was moving from chair to chair, and when the bustle was over, Sylvia was seated at some distance from him, and he left standing outside the circle as if he were not playing. In fact, Sylvia had unconsciously taken his place as actor in the game, while he remained spectator, and, as it turned out, an auditor of a conversation not intended for his ears. He was wedged against the wall, close to the great 8-day clock, with its round moonlight smiling face forming a ludicrous contrast to his long, sallow, grave countenance, which was pretty much at the same level above the sanded floor. Before him sat Molly Brunton and one of her sisters, their heads close together in too deep talk to attend to the progress of the game. Philip's attention was caught by the words, "I'll lay wager he kissed her when he ran off into the parlour." "She's so coy, she never let him," replied Bessie Corney. "She couldn't have helped herself, and for all she looks so demure and prim now," and then both heads were turned into the direction of Sylvia. "I'm as sure as I'm born that Charlie is not the chap to lose his forfeit, and yet, you see, he says nothing more about it, and she left off being afeard of him." There was something in Sylvia's look, aye, and in Charlie Kinraid's too, that shot conviction into Philip's mind. He watched them incessantly during the interval before supper. They were intimate and yet shy with each other, and a matter that enraged while it bewildered Philip. What was Charlie saying to her in that whispered voice as they passed each other? Why did they linger near each other? Why did Sylvia look so dreamily happy, so startled at every call of the game, as if recalled from some pleasant idea? Why did Kinraid's eyes always seek her, while hers were averted or downcast, and her cheeks all aflame? Philip's dark brow grew darker as he gazed. He, too, started when Mrs. Corney, close at his elbow, bade him to go into supper along with some of the elder ones who were not playing, for the parlour was not large enough to hold all at once, even with the squeezing and cramming and sitting together on chairs, which was not at all out of etiquette in Monkshaven. Philip was too reserved to express his disappointment and annoyance at being thus arrested in his painful watch over Sylvia, but he had no appetite for the good things set before him, and found it hard work to smile a sickly smile when called upon by Josiah Pratt for applause at some country joke. When supper was ended, there was some little discussion between Mrs. Corney and her son-in-law as to whether the different individuals of the company should be called upon for songs or stories, as was the wont at such convivial meetings. Brunton had been helping his mother-in-law in urging people to eat, heaping their plates over their shoulders with unexpected good things, filling the glasses at the upper end of the table, and the mugs which supplied the deficiency of glasses at the lower. And now, everyone being satisfied, not to say stuffed to repletion, the two who had been attending to their wants stood still, hot and exhausted. "The room is stored," said Mrs. Corney with a pleased smile. "It be manners to ask some one as knows how to sing." "It may be manners for full men, but not for fasting," replied Brunton. "Folks in t' next room will be wanting their victual, and singing is allays out of tune to empty bellies." "But there's them here as 'll take it ill if they're not asked. I heerd Josiah Pratt all clearing his throat not a minute ago, and he thinks as much on his singing as a cock does on his crowing." "If one sings, I'm afeard all of 'em will like to hear their own pipes." But that dilemma was solved by Bessie Corney, who opened the door to see if the hungry ones outside might not come in for their share of the entertainment, and in they rushed, bright and riotous, scarcely giving the first party time to rise from their seats ere they took their places. One or two young men, released from all their previous shyness, helped Mrs. Corney and her daughters to carry off such dishes as were actually empty. There was no time for changing or washing of plates, but then, as Mrs. Corney laughingly observed, "We're on us friends, and some of us may have sweethearts, so no need to be particular about the plates. Them as gets clean ones is lucky, and them as doesn't, and cannot pick up with the plates as has been used, mun go it out." It seemed to be Philip's luck that night to be pent up in places, for again the space between the benches and the wall was filled up by the inrush before he had time to make his way out, and all he could do was sit quiet where he was. But between the busy heads and overreaching arms he could see Charlie and Sylvia sitting close together, talking and listening more than eating. She was in a new strange state of happiness, not to be reasoned about or accounted for, but in a state of more exquisite feeling than she had ever experienced before, when suddenly, lifting her eyes, she caught Philip's face of extreme displeasure. "Oh," said she, "I must go. There's Philip looking at me so." "Philip," said Kinraid, with a sudden frown upon his face. "You're ready at last, are you?" "Yes," she replied, in her little beseeching tone. "You've not been wanting to go long, have you? I have just eaten my supper." "You've been so full of talk that's the reason your supper lasted so long. That fellow's none going with us," he said sharply, as he saw Kinraid rummaging for his cap in a heap of men's clothes thrown into the back kitchen. "No," said Sylvia in affront at Philip's fierce look and passionate tone. "I telled him not." But at that moment the heavy outer door was opened by Daniel Robson himself, bright, broad, and rosy, a jolly impersonation of winter. His large drover's coat was covered with snowflakes, and through the black frame of the doorway might be seen a white waste world of sweeping fell and field, with the dark air filled with the pure downfall. Robson stamped his snow-laden feet and shook himself well, still standing on the mat, and letting a cold frosty current of fresh air into the green warm kitchen. He laughed at them all before he spoke. "Ha ha! It's a cold New Year as I'm letting in, though it's none to New Year yet. I'll be snowed up sure as my name is Daniel if you stop for 12 o'clock. You better make haste and go home. Why, Charlie, my lad, how besit ya? Who had thought to see thee in these parts again? Nay, Mrs. Nay, to knew your man find his way into house by himself or me, for I ha' promised my old woman to bring Sylvia home as quick as may be. She's lying awake and fretting about the snow and what not. Thank you kindly, missus, but I'll talk and not to eat. Just a dropful of something hot to keep out the cold, and wish you all the compliments of the season. Philip, my man, you not be sorry to be spared to walk round Easterbank such a neat. My missus were such a way about Sylvie that I thought to just to step out myself and have a peep at you and bring her some wraps. Your sheep will be off all the reckon, Master Pratt, for there'll never be a nibble o' grass to be seen these 2 months, according to my reading, and I've been at sea long enough and on land long enough to know the signs and wonders. It's good stuff that way anyway, and worth coming for," after he had gulped down a tumblerful of half and half grog. "Kinraid, if ta doesn't come and see me before thou'lt many days older, thee and me'll have words. Come, Sylvie, what art thou about keeping me here? Here's Mr. Scorney mixing me another jorum. Well, this time we give tea, married happily, and 'tis single wed." Sylvia was all this while standing by her father, quite ready for departure, and not a little relieved by his appearance as her convoy home. "My cousin," she replied, instinctively comprehending what had flashed into his mind, and anxious to disclaim the suspicion of having a lover. "Mother told him to see me home, and he's mun for staying out late." "But you needn't go. I'll see you home." "Mother's but ailing," said Sylvia, a little conscience smitten at having so entirely forgotten everything in the delight of the present. "And I said I wouldn't to be late." "And you always keep your word," said he, with a tender meaning in his tone. "Always, leastways I think so," replied she, blushing. "Then, if I ask you not to forget me, and you give me your word, I am sure you'll keep it." "It wasn't I as forgot you," said Sylvia, so softly as not to be heard by him. He tried to make her repeat what she had said, but she would not, and he could only conjecture that it was something more telltale than she liked to say again, and that alone was very charming to him. "I shall walk home with you," said he, as Sylvia at last rose to depart, warned by a further glimpse at Philip's angry face. "No," she said hastily, "I cannot do with you," for somehow she felt need of pacifying Philip, and knew in her heart that a third person joining their tete-a-tete walk would only increase his displeasure. "What at?" said Charlie sharply. "I don't know, only please don't." By this time her cloak and hood were on, and she was slowly making her way down her side of the room, followed by Charlie, and often interrupted by indignant remonstrances against her departure and the early breaking up of the party. Philip stood hat in hand in the doorway between the kitchen and parlour, watching her so intently that he forgot to be civil, and drew many a jest and gibe upon him for his absorption in his pretty cousin. When Sylvia reached him, he said, "I'm ready to see Haysterbank to-night, master," said Kinraid, with easy freedom, a freedom which Philip envied, but could not have imitated, although he was deeply disappointed at the loss of his walk with Sylvia, when he had intended to exercise the power his aunt had delegated to him, of remonstrance if her behaviour had been light or thoughtless, and of warning if he saw cause to disapprove of any of her associates. After the Robsons had left, a blank fell upon both Charlie and Philip. In a few minutes, however, the former, accustomed to prompt decision, resolved that she and no other should be his wife. Accustomed to popularity among women, and well versed in the incipient signs of their liking for him, he anticipated no difficulty in winning her. Satisfied with the past, and pleasantly hopeful about the future, he found it easy to turn his attention to the next prettiest girl in the room, and to make the whole gathering bright with his ready good temper and buoyant spirit. Mrs. Corney had felt it her duty to press Philip to stay, now that, as she said, he had no one but himself to see home, and the New Year so near come. To anyone else in the room she would have added the clinching argument, "I should take it very unkind if you go now." But somehow she could not say this, for in truth Philip's look showed that he would be but a wet blanket on the merriment of the party. So, with as much civility as could be mustered up between them, he took leave. Shutting the door behind him, he went out into the dreary night, and began his lonesome walk back to Monkshaven. The cold sleet almost blinded him, as the sea wind drove it straight in his face. It cut against him as it was blown with drifting force. The roar of the wintry sea came borne on the breeze. There was more light from the whitened ground than from the dark laden sky above. The field paths would have been a matter of perplexity had it not been for well-known gaps in the dike side, which showed the whitened land beyond, between the two dark stone walls. Yet he went clear and straight along his way, having unconsciously left all guidance to the animal instincts which coexist with the human soul, and sometimes take strange. The field paths would have been a matter of perplexity had it not been for the well-known gaps in the dike side, which showed the whitened land beyond, between the two dark stone walls. Yet he went clear and straight along his way, having unconsciously left all guidance to the animal instinct which coexists with the human soul, and sometimes takes strange charge of human body, when all the nobler powers of the individual are absorbed in acute suffering. At length he was in the lane, toiling up the hill, from which by day Monkshaven might be seen. Now all features of the landscape before him were lost in the darkness of night, against which the white flakes came closer and nearer, thicker and faster. On a sudden, the bells of Monkshaven church rang out to welcome the New Year, 1796. From the direction of the wind, it seemed as if the sound was flung with strength and power right into Philip's face. He walked down the hill to its merry sound, his heavy heart. As he entered the long high street of Monkshaven, he could see the watching lights put out in parlour, chamber, or kitchen. The New Year had come, and expectation was ended. Reality had begun. He turned to the right into the court where he lodged with Alice Rose. There was a light still burning there, and cheerful voices were heard. He opened the door. Alice, her daughter, and Coulson stood as if awaiting him. Hester's wet cloak hung on a chair before the fire. She had her hood on, for she and Coulson had been to the watch night. The solemn excitement of the services had left its traces upon her countenance and in her mind. There was a spiritual light in her usually shadowed eyes, and a slight flush on her pale cheek. Merely personal and self-conscious feelings were merged in a loving goodwill to all her fellow creatures. Under the influence of this large charity, she forgot her habitual reserve, and came forward as Philip entered to meet him with her New Year's wishes that she had previously exchanged with the other two. "A happy New Year to you, Philip, and may God have you in his keeping all the days thereof." He took her hand and shook it warmly in reply. The flush on her cheek deepened as she withdrew it. Alice Rose said something curtly about the lateness of the hour, and her being much tired, and then she and her daughter went upstairs to the front chamber, and Philip and Coulson to that which they had shared at the back of the house. End of chapter 12, part 2. Recording by Linda Velwest.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 13. Perplexities. Coulson and Philip were friendly, but not intimate. They never had had a dispute. They never were confidential with each other. In truth,
They were both reserved and silent men, and probably respected each other the more for being so self-contained. There was a private feeling in Coulson's heart which would have made a less amiable fellow dislike Philip, but of this the latter was unconscious. They were not apt to exchange many words in the room which they occupied jointly. Coulson asked Philip if he had enjoyed himself at the Corneys', and Philip replied, "Not much. Such parties are noane to my liking." "And yet thou broke off from t' watch night to go there." No answer. So Coulson went on, with a sense of the duty laid upon him, to improve the occasion, the first that had presented itself since the good old Methodist minister had given his congregation the solemn warning to watch over the opportunities of various kinds which the coming year would present. "Jonas Barclay told us as the pleasures of this world were like the apples of Sodom, pleasant to look at, but ashes to taste." Coulson wisely left Philip to make the application for himself. If he did, he made no sign, but threw himself on his bed with a heavy sigh. "Are you not going to undress?" said Coulson, as he covered him up in bed. There had been a long pause of silence. Philip did not answer him, and he thought he had fallen asleep. But he was roused from his first slumber by Hepburn's soft movements about the room. Philip had thought better of it, and with some penitence in his heart for his gruffness to the unoffending Coulson, was trying not to make any noise while he undressed. But he could not sleep. He kept seeing the Corneys' kitchen, and the scenes that had taken place in it, passing like a pageant before his closed eyes. Then he opened them in angry weariness at the recurring vision, and tried to make out the outlines of the room and the furniture in the darkness. The white ceiling sloped into the whitewashed walls, and against them he could see the 4 rush-bottomed chairs, the looking-glass hung on one side, the old carved oak chest, his own property, with the initials of forgotten ancestors cut upon it, which held his clothes, the boxes that belonged to Coulson, sleeping soundly in the bed in the opposite corner of the room, the casement window in the roof, through which the snowy ground on the steep hillside could be plainly seen. And when he got so far as this in the catalogue of the room, he fell into a troubled, feverish sleep, which lasted 2 or 3 hours, and then he awoke with a start and a consciousness of uneasiness, though what about he could not remember at first. When he recollected all that had happened the night before, it impressed him much more favourably than it had done at the time. If not joy, hope had come in the morning, and at any rate he could be up and doing, for the late wintry light was stealing down the hillside, and he knew that, although Coulson lay motionless in his sleep, it was past their usual time of rising. Still, as it was New Year's Day, a time of some licence, Philip had mercy on his fellow shopman, and did not waken him till just as he was leaving the room. Carrying his shoes in his hand, he went softly downstairs, for he could see from the top of the flight that neither Alice nor her daughter was down yet, as the kitchen shutters were not unclosed. It was Mrs. Rose's habit to rise early, and have all bright and clean against her lodgers came down. But then, in general, she went to rest before 9 o'clock, whereas the last night she had not gone till past 12. Philip went about undoing the shutters, and trying to break up the raking coal with as little noise as might be, for he had compassion on the tired sleepers. The kettle had not been filled, probably because Mrs. Rose had been unable to face the storm of the night before, in taking it to the pump just at the entrance of the court. When Philip came back from filling it, he found Alice and Hester both in the kitchen, and trying to make up for lost time by hastening over their work. Hester looked busy and notable with her gown pinned up behind her, and her hair all tucked away under a clean linen cap. But Alice was angry with herself for her late sleeping, and that and other causes made her speak crossly to Philip as he came in with his snowy feet and well-filled kettle. 'Look thee there, dropping and dripping along to flags as was cleaned last night, and meddling wi' women's work as a man has no business wi'.' Philip was surprised and annoyed. He had found relief from his own thoughts in doing what he believed would help others. He gave up the kettle to her snatching hands, and sate down behind the door in momentary ill temper. But the kettle was better filled and consequently heavier than the old woman expected, and she could not manage to lift it to the crook from which it generally hung suspended. She looked round for Hester, but she was gone into the back kitchen. In a minute Philip was at her side, and had heaved it to its place for her. She looked in his face for a moment wistfully, but hardly condescended to thank him. At least the sound of the words did not pass the lips that formed them. Rebuffed by her manner, he went back to his old seat and mechanically watched the preparations for breakfast, but his thoughts went back to the night before, and the comparative ease of his heart was gone. The first stir of a new day had made him feel as if he had no sufficient cause for his annoyance and despondency the previous evening, But now, condemned to sit quiet, he reviewed looks and words, and saw just reason for his anxiety. After some consideration, he resolved to go that very night to Haytersbank, and have some talk with either Sylvia or her mother. What the exact nature of this proposed conversation should be, he did not determine. Much would depend on Sylvia's manner and mood, and on her mother's state of health, but at any rate something would be learnt. During breakfast something was learnt nearer home, though not all that a man less unconscious and more vain than Philip might have discovered. He only found out that Mrs. Rose was displeased with him for not having gone to the watch night with Hester, according to the plan made some weeks before. But he soothed his conscience by remembering that he had made no promise. He had merely spoken of his wish to be present at the service about which Hester was speaking, and although at the time and for a good while afterwards he had fully intended going, yet as there had been William Coulson to accompany her, his absence could not have been seriously noticed. Still he was made uncomfortable by Mrs. Rose's change of manner. Once or twice he said to himself that she little knew how miserable he had been during his gay evening, as she would persist in calling it, or she would not talk at him with such persevering bitterness this morning. Before he left for the shop, he spoke of his intention of going to see how his aunt was, and of paying her a New Year's Day visit. Hepburn and Coulson took it in turns, week and week about, to go first home to dinner. The one who went first sate down with Mrs. Rose and her daughter, instead of having his portion put in the oven to keep warm for him. To-day it was Hepburn's turn to be last. All morning the shop was full with customers, come rather to offer good wishes than to buy, and with an unspoken remembrance of the cake and wine which the two hospitable brothers Foster made a point of offering to all comers on New Year's Day. It was busy work for all, for Hester on her side, where caps, ribbons, and women's gear were exclusively sold, for the shopmen and boys in the grocery and drapery department. Philip was trying to do his business with his mind far away, and the consequence was that his manner was not such as to recommend him to the customers, some of whom recollected it as very different, courteous and attentive, if grave and sedate. One buxom farmer's wife noticed the change to him. She had a little girl with her, of about 5 years old, that she had lifted up on the counter, and who was watching Philip with anxious eyes, occasionally whispering in her mother's ear, and then hiding her face against her cloak. "She's thought a deal o' coming to see you, and I dunnot think as you mind her at all. My pretty, he's clean forgotten as how he said last New Year's Day he'd gie thee a barley sugar stick if thou'd hem him a handkerchief by this." The child's face was buried in the comfortable breadth of duffel at these words, while the little outstretched hand held a small square of coarse linen. "Ay, she's noane forgotten it, and has done her 5 stitches a day, bless her, and I dunnot believe as you know her again. She's Phoebe Moorsome, and I'm Hannah, and I've dealt at t' shop regular this 15 year. "I'm very sorry," said Philip. "I was up late last night, and I'm a bit dazed to day." "Well, this is nice work, Phoebe, and I'm sure I'm very much beholden to you. And here's 5 sticks of barley sugar, one for every stitch. And thank ye kindly, Mrs. Moorsome, too." Philip took the handkerchief, and hoped he had made honourable amends for his want of recognition. But the wee lassie refused to be lifted down, and whispered something afresh into her mother's ear, who smiled and bade her be quiet. Philip saw, however, that there was some wish ungratified on the part of the little maiden, which he was expected to inquire into, and accordingly he did his duty. "She's a little fool. She says you promised to gie her a kiss, and to make her your wife." The child burrowed her face closer into her mother's neck, and refused to allow the kiss which Philip willingly offered. All he could do was to touch the back of the little white fat neck with his lips. The mother carried her off only half satisfied, and Philip felt that he must try and collect his scattered wits, and be more alive to the occasion. Towards the dinner hour the crowd slackened. Hester began to replenish decanters and bottles, and to bring out a fresh cake before she went home to dinner, and Coulson and Philip looked over the joint present they always made to her on this day. It was a silk handkerchief of the prettiest colours they could pick out of the shop, intended for her to wear round her neck. Each tried to persuade the other to give it to her, for each was shy of the act of presentation. Coulson was, however, the most resolute, and when she returned from the parlour, the little parcel was in Philip's hands. "Here, Hester," said he, going round the counter to her, just as she was leaving the shop. "It's from Coulson and me, a handkerchief for you to wear, and we wish you a happy New Year, and plenty on 'em, and there's many a one wishes the same." He took her hand as he said this. She went a little paler, and her eyes brightened as though they would fill with tears as they met his. She could not have helped it, do what she would. But she only said, "Thank you kindly," and going up to Coulson she repeated the words and action to him. and then they went off together to dinner. There was a lull of business for the next hour. John and Jeremiah were dining like the rest of the world. Even the elder errand boy had vanished. Philip rearranged disorderly goods, and then sate down on the corner by the window. It was the habitual place for one who stayed behind, for excepting on market day, there was little or no custom during the noon hour. Formerly he used to move the drapery with which the window was ornamented, and watch the passers-by with careless eye. But now, though he seemed to gaze abroad, he saw nothing but vacancy. All the morning since he got up he had been trying to fight through his duties, leaning against a hope that first had bowed and then had broke as soon as he really tried its weight. There was not a sign of Sylvia's liking for him to be gathered from the most careful recollection of the past evening. It was of no use thinking that there was. It was better to give it up altogether and at once. But what if he could not? What if the thought of her was bound up with his life, and that once torn out by his own free will, the very roots of his heart must come also? No, he was resolved he would go on. As long as there was life, there was hope. As long as Sylvia remained unpledged to any one else, there was a chance for him. He would remodel his behaviour to her. He could not be merry and light-hearted like other young men. His nature was not cast in that mould, and the early sorrows that had left him a lonely orphan might have matured, but had not enlivened, his character. He thought with some bitterness on the power of easy talking about trifles which some of those he had met with at the Corneys had exhibited. But then he felt stirring within him a force of enduring love which he believed to be unusual, and which seemed as if it must compel all things to his wish in the end. A year or so ago he had thought much of his own cleverness and his painfully acquired learning, and he had imagined that these were the qualities which were to gain Sylvia. But now, whether he had tried them and had failed to win even her admiration, or whether some true instinct had told him that a woman's love may be gained in many ways sooner than by mere learning, he was only angry with himself for his past folly in making himself her school, nay, her taskmaster. To-night, though, he would start off on a new tack. He would not even upbraid her for her conduct the night before. He had shown her his displeasure at the time, but she would see how tender and forgiving he could be. He would lure her to him rather than find fault with her. There had perhaps been too much of that already. When Coulson came back, Philip went to his solitary dinner. In general, he was quite alone while eating it, but to-day Alice Rose chose to bear him company. She watched him with cold, severe eye for some time, until he had appeased his languid appetite. Then she began with the rebuke she had in store for him, a rebuke the motives to which were not entirely revealed even to herself. 'Thou are none so keen after thy food as common,' she began. 'Plain victuals goes ill down after feasting.' Philip felt the colour mount to his face. He was not in the mood for patiently standing the brunt of the attack which he saw was coming, and yet he had a reverent feeling for women and for age. He wished she would leave him alone, but he only said, 'I had nought but a slice o' cold beef for supper, if you'll call that feasting.' 'Neither do godly ways savour delicately after the pleasures of the world,' continued she, unheeding his speech. 'Thou wert wont to seek the house of the Lord, and I thought well on thee. But of late thou'st changed, and fallen away, and I mun speak what is in my heart towards thee.' 'Mother,' said Philip impatiently. Both he and Coulson called Alice mother at times. 'I don't think I'm fallen away, and anyway I cannot stay now to be. It's New Year's Day, and t' shop is throng.' But Alice held up her hand. Her speech was ready, and she must deliver it. 'Shop here, shop there, the flesh and the devil are getting hold on you, and you need more nor ever to speak to ways o' grace. New Year's Day comes and says, "Watch and pray," and yo' say, "Nay, I'll seek feasts and market places, and let times and seasons come and go without heeding into whose presence they're hastening me." Time was, Philip, when thou'd niver ha' letten a merry making keep thee fra' watch night, and t' company o' the godly.' 'I tell you it was no merry making to me,' said Philip with sharpness, as he left the house. Alice sat down on the nearest seat, and leant her head on her wrinkled hand. 'He's tangled and snared,' said she. 'My heart has yearned after him, and I esteemed him as one of the elect, and more nor me yearns after him. O Lord, I have but one child. O Lord, spare her. But o'er and above a', I would like to pray for his soul, that Satan might not have it, for he came to me but a little lad.' At that moment Philip, smitten by his conscience for his hard manner of speech, came back, but Alice did not hear or see him until he was close by her, and then he had to touch her to recall her attention. 'Mother,' he said, I was wrong. I'm fretted by many things. I shouldn't ha' spoken so. It was ill done of me. Oh, my lad, said she, looking up and putting her thin arm on his shoulder as he stooped, Satan is desiring after you, that he may sift you as wheat. Bide at home, and go not after them as care not for holy things. Why need you go to Haytersbank this night? Philip reddened. He could not and would not give it up, and yet it was difficult to resist the pleading of this usually stern old woman. Nay, said he, withdrawing himself ever so little from her hold, my aunt is but ailing. They're my own flesh and blood, and as good folks as needs be, though they mayn't be your way o' thinking on a' things. Our ways, your ways o' thinking, says he, as if they were no longer his'n. And as good folks as need be, repeated she with returning severity. Them's Satan's words. Thou you spoke 'em, Philip. I can do nought against Satan, but I can speak to them as can, and we'll see which pulls hardest, for it'll be better for thee to be riven and rent i' twain than to go body and soul to hell. But don't think, mother, said Philip, his last words of conciliation, for the clock had given warning for 2, as I'm bound for hell, just because I go to see my own folks, all I ha' left o' kin. Once more, after laying his hands with as much of a caress as was in his nature, or hers, he left the house. Probably Alice would have considered the first words that greeted Philip on his entrance into the shop as an answer to her prayer, for they were such as put a stop to his plan of going to see Sylvia that evening, and if Alice had formed her inchoate thoughts into words, Sylvia would have appeared as the nearest earthly representative of the spirit of temptation whom she dreaded for Philip. As he took his place behind the counter, Coulson said to him in a low voice, Jeremiah Foster has been round to bid us to sup wi' him to night. He says that he and John have a little matter of business to talk over with us. A glance from his eyes to Philip told the latter that Coulson believed the business spoken of had something to do with the partnership, respecting which there had been a silent intelligence for some time between the shopmen. And what did thou say? asked Philip, doggedly unwilling even yet to give up his proposed visit. Say? Why, what could I say but that we'd come? There was summat up, for sure, and summat as he thought we should be glad on. I could tell it for to look on his face. I don't think as I can go, said Philip, feeling just then as if the long-hoped-for partnership was as nothing compared to his plan. It was always distasteful to him to have to give up a project, or to disarrange an intended order of things, such was his nature, but to-day it was absolute pain to yield his own purpose. Why, man alive, said Coulson in amaze at his reluctance. I didn't say I mightn't go, said Philip, weighing consequences, until called off to attend to customers. In the course of the afternoon, however, he felt himself more easy in deferring his visit to Haytersbank till the next evening. Charlie Kinraid entered the shop, accompanied by Molly Brunton and her sisters, and though they all went towards Hester's side of the shop, and Philip and Coulson had many people to attend to, yet Hepburn's sharpened ears caught much of what the young women were saying. From that he gathered that Kinraid had promised them New Year's gifts, for the purchase of which they were come, and after a little more listening he learned that Kinraid was returning to Shields the next day, having only come over to spend a holiday with his relations, and being tied with ship's work at the other end. They all talked together lightly and merrily, as if his going or staying was almost a matter of indifference to himself and his cousins. The principal thought of the young women was to secure the articles they most fancied. Charlie Kinraid was, so Philip thought, especially anxious that the youngest and prettiest should be pleased. Hepburn watched him perpetually with a kind of envy of his bright courteous manner, the natural gallantry of the sailor. If it were but clear that Sylvia took as little thought of him as he did of her, to all appearance, Philip could even have given him praise for manly good looks, and a certain kind of geniality of disposition, which made him ready to smile pleasantly at all strangers, from babies upwards. As the party turned to leave the shop, they saw Philip, the guest of the night before, and they came over to shake hands with him across the counter. Kinraid's hand was proffered among the number. Last night Philip could not have believed it possible that such a demonstration of fellowship should have passed between them, and perhaps there was a slight hesitation of manner on his part, for some idea or remembrance crossed Kinraid's mind, which brought a keen searching glance into the eyes which for a moment were fastened on Philip's face. In spite of himself, and during the very act of handshaking, Philip felt a cloud come over his face, not altering or moving his features, but taking light and peace out of his countenance. Molly Brunton began to say something, and he gladly turned to look at her. She was asking him why he went away so early, for they had kept it up for 4 hours after he left; and last of all, she added, turning to Kinraid, her cousin Charlie had danced a hornpipe among the platters on the ground. Philip hardly knew what he said in reply. The mention of that pas seul lifted such a weight off his heart. He could smile now, after his grave fashion, and would have shaken hands again with Kinraid had it been required; for it seemed to him that no one, caring ever so little in the way that he did for Sylvia, could have borne 4 mortal hours of a company where she had been, and was not, least of all, could have danced a hornpipe either from gaiety of heart, or even out of complaisance. He felt as if the yearning after the absent one would have been a weight to his legs, as well as to his spirit, and he imagined that all men were like himself. End of chapter 13.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 14. Partnership. As darkness closed in, and the New Year's throng became scarce, Philip's hesitation about accompanying Coulson faded away. He was more comfortable respecting Sylvia, and his going to see her might be deferred; and, after all, he felt that the wishes of his masters ought to be attended to, and the honour of an invitation to the private house of Jeremiah not to be slighted for anything short of a positive engagement. Besides, the ambitious man of business existed strongly in Philip. It would never do to slight advances towards the second great earthly object in his life, one also on which the first depended. So when the shop was closed, the two set out down Bridge Street to cross the river to the house of Jeremiah Foster. They stood a moment on the bridge to breathe the keen fresh sea air after their busy day. The waters came down swollen, full, and dark, with rapid rushing speed from the snow-fed springs high up on the moorland above. The close-packed houses in the old town seemed a cluster of white roofs irregularly piled against the more unbroken white of the hillside. Lights twinkled here and there in the town, and were slung from stern and bow of the ships in the harbour. The air was very still, settling in for a frost; so still that all distant sounds seemed near. The rumble of a returning cart in the High Street, the voices on board ship, the closing of shutters and barring of doors in the new town to which they were bound. But the sharp air was filled, as it were, with saline particles in a freezing state, little pungent crystals of sea salt, burning lips and cheeks with their cold keenness. It would not do to linger here in the very centre of the valley, up which passed the current of atmosphere coming straight with the rushing tide from the icy northern seas. Besides, there was the unusual honour of a supper with Jeremiah Foster awaiting them. He had asked each of them separately to a meal before now, but they had never gone together, and they felt that there was something serious in the conjuncture. They began to climb the steep heights leading to the freshly built rows of the new town of Monkshaven, feeling as if they were rising into aristocratic regions where no shop profaned the streets. Jeremiah Foster's house was one of 6, undistinguished in size, or shape, or colour, but noticed in the daytime by all passers-by for its spotless cleanliness of lintel and doorstep, window and window frame. The very bricks seemed as though they came in for the daily scrubbing which brightened handle, knocker, all down to the very scraper. The 2 young men felt as shy of the interview with their master under such unusual relations of guest and host as a girl does of her first party. Each rather drew back from the decided step of knocking at the door, but with a rebuffing shake at his own folly, Philip was the one to give a loud single rap. As if they had been waited for, the door flew open, and a middle-aged servant stood behind, as spotless and neat as the house itself, and smiled a welcome to the familiar faces. "Let me dust your bit, William," said she, suiting the action to the word. "You've been leaning against some whitewash, I'll be bound. Ay, Philip," continued she, turning him round with motherly freedom, "he'll do if you'll but gie your shoon a polish wipe on your other mat. This'n for taking roughest mud off. Master lays polishes on that." In the square parlour the same precise order was observed. Every article of furniture was free from speck of dirt or particle of dust, and everything was placed either in a parallel line or at exact right angles with every other. Even John and Jeremiah sat in symmetry on opposite sides of the fireplace, the very smiles on their honest faces seemed drawn to a line of exactitude. Such formality, however admirable, was not calculated to promote ease. It was not until after supper, until a good quantity of Yorkshire pie had been swallowed, and washed down too with the best and most generous wine in Jeremiah's cellar, that there was the least geniality among them, in spite of the friendly kindness of the host and his brother. The long silence, during which mute thanks for the meal were given, having come to an end, Jeremiah called for pipes, and 3 of the party began to smoke. Politics in those days were tickle subjects to meddle with, even in the most private company. The nation was in a state of terror against France, and against any at home who might be supposed to sympathise with the enormities she had just been committing. The oppressive Act against seditious meetings had been passed the year before, and people were doubtful to what extremity of severity it might be construed. Even the law authorities forgot to be impartial, but either their alarms or their interests made too many of them vehement partisans instead of calm arbiters, and thus destroyed the popular confidence in what should have been considered the supreme tribunal of justice. Yet, for all this, there were some who dared to speak of reform of Parliament as a preliminary step to fair representation of the people, and to a reduction of the heavy war taxation that was imminent, if not already imposed. But these pioneers of 1830 were generally obnoxious. The great body of the people gloried in being Tories and haters of the French, with whom they were on tenterhooks to fight, almost unaware of the rising reputation of the young Corsican warrior, whose name would be used ere a dozen years had passed to hush English babies with a terror such as that of Marlborough once had for the French. At such a place as Monkshaven all these opinions were held in excess. 1 or 2 might, for the mere sake of argument, dispute on certain points of history or government, but they took care to be very sure of their listeners before such arguments touched on anything of the present day, for it had been not unfrequently found that the public duty of prosecuting opinions not your own overrode the private duty of respecting confidence. Most of the Monkshaven politicians confined themselves, therefore, to such general questions as these: Could an Englishman lick more than 4 Frenchmen at a time? What was the proper punishment for members of the Corresponding Society (correspondence with the French Directory)? Hanging and quartering, or burning? Would the forthcoming child of the Princess of Wales be a boy or a girl? If a girl, would it be more loyal to call it Charlotte or Elizabeth? The Fosters were quite secure enough of their guests this evening to have spoken freely on politics had they been so inclined. And they did begin on the outrages which had been lately offered to the king in crossing St. James's Park to go and open the House of Lords; but soon, so accustomed were their minds to caution and restraint, the talk dropped down to the high price of provisions: bread at 1 shilling and 3d, the quartern loaf according to the London test; wheat at 120 shillings per quarter, as the home-baking northerners viewed the matter; and then the conversation died away to an ominous silence. John looked at Jeremiah, as if asking him to begin. Jeremiah was the host, and had been a married man. Jeremiah returned the look with the same meaning in it. John, though a bachelor, was the elder brother. The great church bell, brought from the Monkshaven monastery centuries ago, high up on the opposite hillside, began to ring 9 o'clock. It was getting late. Jeremiah began. "It seems a bad time for starting anyone on business, with prices and taxes and bread so dear, but John and I are getting into years, and we've no children to follow us. Yet we would fain draw out of some of our worldly affairs. We would like to give up the shop, and stick to banking, to which there seemeth a plain path. But first there is the stock and goodwill the shop to be disposed on." A dead pause. This opening was not favourable to the hopes of the 2 moneyless young men who had been hoping to succeed their masters by the more gradual process of partnership. But it was only the kind of speech that had been agreed upon by the 2 brothers with a view of impressing upon Hepburn and Coulson the great and unusual responsibility of the situation into which the Fosters wished them to enter. In some ways the talk of many was much less simple and straightforward in those days than it is now. The study of effect shown in the London diners out of the last generation, who prepared their conversation beforehand, was not without its parallel in humbler spheres, and for different objects in self-display. The brothers Foster had all but rehearsed the speeches they were about to make this evening. They were aware of the youth of the parties to whom they were going to make a most favourable proposal, and they dreaded that if that proposal was too lightly made, it would be too lightly considered, and the duties involved in it too carelessly entered upon. So the rôle of one brother was to suggest, that of the other to repress. The young men, too, had their reserves. They foresaw, and had long foreseen, what was coming that evening. They were impatient to hear it in distinct words, and yet they had to wait, as if unconscious, during all the long preamble. Do age and youth never play the same parts now? To return, John Foster replied to his brother. "The stock and goodwill? That would take much wealth, and there will be fixtures to be considered. Philip, canst thee tell me the exact amount of stock in the shop at present?" It had only just been taken. Philip had it at his fingers' ends. £1,941, 13 shillings and twopence. Coulson looked at him in a little dismay, and could not repress a sigh. The figures put into words and spoken aloud seemed to indicate so much larger an amount of money than when quickly written down in numerals. But Philip read the countenances, nay, by some process of which he was not himself aware, he read the minds of the brothers, and felt no dismay at what he saw there. "And the fixtures?" asked John Foster. "The appraiser valued them at £435 3 and 6 when father died. We have added to them since, but we will reckon them at that. How much does that make with the value of the stock?" £2,176 16 shillings and 8 pence, said Philip. Coulson had done the sum quicker, but was too much disheartened by the amount to speak. "And the goodwill?" asked the pitiless John. "What dost thee set that at?" "I think, brother, that would depend on who came forward with the purchase money of the stock and fixtures. To some folks we might make it sit easy, if they were known to us, and those as we wished well to. If Philip and William here, for instance, said they'd like to purchase the business, I reckon thee and me would not ask him so much as we should ask Miller's." Miller's was an upstart petty rival shop at the end of the bridge in the new town. "I wish Philip and William was to come after us," said John. "But that's out of the question," he continued, knowing all the while that, far from being out of the question, it was the very question, and that it was as good as settled at this very time. No one spoke. Then Jeremiah went on. "It's out of the question, I reckon." He looked at the two young men. Coulson shook his head. Philip more bravely said, "I have £53 7 and 4 in your hands, Master John, and it's all I have in world." "It's a pity," said John, and again they were silent. 9:30 struck. It was time to be beginning to make an end. "Perhaps, brother, they have friends who could advance them the money. We might make it sit light to them, for the sake of their good service." Philip replied, "There's no one who can put forwards a penny for me. I have but few kin, and they have little to spare beyond what they need." Coulson said, "My father and mother have 9 on us." Let alone," said John, relenting fast, for he was weary of his part of cold stern prudence. "Brother, I think we have enough of this world's goods to do what we like with our own." Jeremiah was a little scandalised at the rapid melting away of assumed character, and took a good pull at his pipe before he replied. "Upwards of £2,000 is a large sum to set on the well-being and well-doing of 2 lads, the elder of whom is not 23. I fear we must look farther afield." "Why, John," replied Jeremiah, "it was but yesterday thee said they would rather have Philip and William than any men of 50 that thee knowed. And now to bring up their youth again them. Well, half on it is thine, and thou shalt do even as thou wilt, but I think as I must have security for my moiety, for it's a great risk. Have you any security to offer, any expectations, any legacies, as the folk have a life interest in at present?" No, neither of them had. So Jeremiah rejoined, "Then, I suppose, I mun do as thee dost, John, and take the security of character. And it's a great security too, lads, and best o' all, and one that I couldn't have done without. No, not if he'd pay me down 5,000 for goodwill and stock and fixtures, for John Foster and Son has been a shop in Monkshaven this 80 years and more, and I do not think there's a man living, or dead for that matter, as can say Foster's wronged him of a penny, or gave short measure to a child or a cousin Betty." They all four shook hands round with the same heartiness as if it had been a legal ceremony necessary to the completion of the partnership. The old men's faces were bright with smiles, the eyes of the young ones sparkled with hope. "But, after all," said Jeremiah, "we've not told you particulars. You're thanking us for a pig in a poke, but we had more forethought, and we put all down on a piece of paper." He took down a folded piece of paper from the mantel-shelf, put on his horn spectacles, and began to read aloud, occasionally peering over his glasses to note the effect on the countenances of the young men. The only thing he was in the habit of reading aloud was a chapter in the Bible daily to his housekeeper servant, and, like many, he reserved a peculiar tone for that solemn occupation, a tone which he unconsciously employed for the present enumeration of pounds, shilling, and pence. "Average returns of the last 3 years, £127, 3 shillings, and 7 penny and 1/6 a week. Profits thereupon, 34 per cent, as near may be. Clear profits of the concern, after deducting all expenses except rent, for the house is our own, £1,202 a year." This was far more than either Hepburn or Coulson had imagined it to be, and a look of surprise, almost amounting to dismay, crept over their faces, in spite of their endeavour to keep simply motionless and attentive. "It's a deal o' money, lads, and the Lord give you grace to guide it," said Jeremiah, putting down his paper for a minute. "Amen," said John, shaking his head to give effect to his word. "Now what we propose is this," continued Jeremiah, beginning afresh to refer to his paper. "We will call value of stock and fixtures 2,150. You may have John Holden, appraiser and auctioneer, in to set a price on them if you will, or you may look over books and bills, or better still do both, and so check one against t'other, but for t' sake o' making the ground of the bargain, I state the sum as above, and I reckon it's so much capital left in your hands, for the use of which you're bound to pay us 5 per cent quarterly, that's £107.10 per annum, at least for t' first year, and after it will be reduced by the gradual payment on our money, which must be at the rate of 20 per cent, thus paying us our principal back in 5 years, and the rent, including all backyards, right of wharfage, warehouse and premises, is reckoned by us to be £65 per annum. So you will have to pay us, John and Jeremiah Foster, brothers, £612.10 of the profits of the first year, leaving, at the present rate of profits, about £589.10 for the share to be divided between you." The plan had, in all its details, been carefully arranged by the two brothers. They were afraid lest Hepburn and Coulson should be dazzled by the amount of profits, and had so arranged the sliding scale of payment as to reduce the first year's income to what the elder men thought a very moderate sum, but what to the younger ones appeared an amount of wealth such as they, who had neither of them ever owned more than £50, considered almost inexhaustible. It was certainly a remarkable instance of prosperity and desert meeting together so early in life. For a moment or two the brothers were disappointed at not hearing any reply from either of them. Then Philip stood up, for he felt as if anything he could say sitting down would not be sufficiently expressive of gratitude, and William instantly followed his example. Hepburn began in a formal manner, something the way in which he had read in the York newspapers that honourable members returned thanks when their health was given. "I can hardly express my feelings," Coulson nudged him. "His feelings, too, of gratitude. Oh, Master John, Master Jeremiah! I thought it might come in time. Nay, I've thought it might come afore long, but I never thought as it would be so much, or made so easy. We've got good kind friends, we have we not, William? And we'll do our best, and I hope as we shall come up to their wishes." Philip's voice quivered a little, as some remembrance passed across his mind. At this unusual moment of expansion out it came. "I wish mother could have seen this day." "She shall see a better day, my lad, when thy name and William's is painted over t' shop door, and J. Foster blacked out." "Nay, master," said William, "that mun never be. I'd almost sooner not come in for t' business. Anyhow, it must be late, Jane J. Foster. I'm not sure as I can stomach that." "Well, well, William," said John Foster, highly gratified, "there'll be time enough to talk over that. There was one thing more to be said, was there not, brother Jeremiah? We do not wish to have this talked over in Monkshaven until shortly before the time when you must enter on the business. We have our own arrangements to make with regard to the banking concern, and there'll be lawyers' work to do after you've examined books and looked over t' stock again together. Maybe we've overstated it, or fixtures aren't worth so much as we said. Anyhow, you must each on you give us your word for to keep fra naming this night's conversation to any one. Meantime, Jeremiah and I will have to pay accounts, and take a kind of farewell of the merchants and manufacturers with whom Fosters have had dealings this 70 or 80 year. And when and where it seems fitting to us, we will take one of you to introduce as our successors and friends. But all that's to come. But you must each give us your word not to name what's passed here to anyone till further speech on the subject has passed between us." Coulson immediately gave the promise. Philip's assent came lagging. He had thought of Sylvia living almost as much as of the dead mother, whose last words had been a committal of her child to the father of the friendless, and now that a short delay was placed between the sight of the cup and his enjoyment of it, there was an impatient chafing in the mind of the composed and self-restrained Philip, and then repentance, quick as lightning, effaced the feeling, and he pledged himself to the secrecy which was enjoined. Some few more details as to their mode of procedure, of verifying the Fosters' statements, which to the younger men seemed a perfectly unnecessary piece of business, of probable journeys and introductions, and then farewell was bidden, and Hepburn and Coulson were in the passage donning their wraps, and rather to their indignation being assisted therein by Martha, who was accustomed to the office with her own master. Suddenly they were recalled into the parlour. John Foster was fumbling with the papers a little nervously. Jeremiah spoke. "We have not thought it necessary to commend Esther Rose to you. If she had been a lad, she would have had a third at business along with you. Being a woman, it's ill troubling her with a partnership. Better give her a fixed salary till such time as she marries." He looked a little knowingly and curiously at the faces of the young men he addressed. William Coulson seemed sheepish and uncomfortable, but said nothing, leaving it as usual to Philip to be spokesman. "If we hadn't cared for Esther for herself, master, we should have cared for her as being forspoken by her. Your master John shall fix what we ought to pay her, and I think I may make bold to say that, as our income rises, hers shall too. Eh, Coulson?" A sound of assent quite distinct enough. "For we both look on her as a sister, and on Alice like a mother, as I told her on this very day." Chapter 14